Welcome to the Smith, Gambrell, and Russell Patent Series podcast. I'm your host today, Michael Riesen. I'm a registered patent attorney in the United States, and I'm a partner in the IP group at Smith, Gambrell, and Russell. I'm joined today by two guests. We're going to be talking about what makes a good patent. My guests are John Stankiewicz, IP counsel with Rolls-Royce. John?
Hello. Hi. Good to be here.
And Matt Prater, IP counsel with SABIC. Matt?
Hey, Mike. Happy to join your podcast.
Thanks. How about we give a little bit of an introduction? John, if you can introduce yourself a bit more for the listeners.
Yeah, sure. So, again, my name is John Stankiewicz. I also am a registered U.S. patent attorney. My background, I've been with Rolls-Royce for not quite 4 years. It'll be 4 years this summer. Prior to joining Rolls-Royce, I was corporate counsel with Caterpillar, and before that, I was an associate with Kenner Colburn, an IP boutique up on the Northeast side. My technical background for anyone that's interested is physics and astrophysics, but the astrophysics gets used a lot less.
That makes sense. I found that physics often comes into play quite a bit. I too have a physics degree. Turning then to Matt, how about you give us a little bit of an introduction for the listeners?
Two physicists. I am a mechanical engineer by training, and I worked as a mechanical engineer for a couple of years in Detroit, making wires for cars, and in Minnesota, making hydraulic pumps for Caterpillar, among others. Then I went to law school and joined IP boutique Schwegman, Lundberg, and Wussner, and was there for 10 years, and then joined SABIC, where I'm senior counsel for SABIC's a chemical company. And you would ask, why is a mechanical engineer working at a chemical company? But SABIC ends up teaching a lot of its customers how to use the plastics that we make to make things, and those things are more like widgets than molecules, and that's what I help them with, getting patents on that.
Matt, I didn't realize you had worked for Cat. We'll have to chat about that offline later.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we made the pumps that we sold into Cat, among others.
Okay, all right, great.
Thanks a lot for the introductions. We've been talking over the years, me and Matt and John separately, about all things, but in particular our jobs, which involves preparing, prosecuting, and defending or litigating or licensing IP, specifically patents. And over that time, we've come into a good spectrum of what we would refer to as what is quality, what is a good patent, what is a bad patent. And having gone through many litigations where we've got claim construction that has very broad claim construction over ambiguous terms, I started thinking, is that really a bad patent? If it can withstand that litigation and those challenges, what makes a good patent? Is that bad to have that ambiguity? So in discussion, I thought with the varying perspectives that we have here with Matt and John online, as well as my perspective in private practice, we'd get together and share our just frank opinions on what might make a good patent. And we're going to divide that discussion into three portions of today's series. The first portion will be the drafting phase of the application. What goes into that and what makes a good draft of a patent application for filing. And the second phase is prosecution. As you go through the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the examination stage here domestically, or even considerations for foreign prosecution. What makes it good prosecution? There could be some tips and tricks or some pitfalls that we've seen that might surprise us as to what's a good strategy and what makes it a quality patent. And finally, what happens after it grants? I mentioned before litigation, there's licensing goals. There's, of course, the IPRs that we see here in the United States for the past 8 years or so. And the question is, does that change the way you draft? Does that change the way you prosecute what makes a good patent when it comes to after it's granted in its defensibility or licensability. So we'll break those three down today, and we'll start, as I mentioned, with drafting the patent application. So to kick it off, I'll just throw it out there. I'll start with John. John, I'd like to have you distill everything you know in your career about drafting patent applications into one word. And that word should describe what's the most important characteristic of a well-drafted patent application.
Well, can I hyphenate? I'm going to hyphenate. I'm going to say,
or switch to German.
That's fine.
I'm going to say in the shortest possible way, business needs. Being aware of what the business needs from that particular application is the most important part of that application. Patents are filed for a lot of different reasons. They can be filed in anticipation of litigation. They can be filed in anticipation of licensing. They can be filed intentionally to block your competitors from, filing into a white space. So being aware of what is the reason behind the filing is the most important characteristic of good drafting.
Matt, what do you think about that?
I think value is where the conversation has to end up. And if you can't make it through the value conversation and clearly explain what your value proposition is, there's a good chance you're throwing you're being a little bit reckless with your IP resources. But to go back to your one word, Mike, I would say precision if I had to pick one word. And the genesis of that is a whole bunch of things. We all been doing this for a long time. It's really hard to distill it all down to a short soundbite. It's a very competitive field, a ton of smart people, a lot of experimentation. But one thing you can't escape is that only a very small percentage of these patents are ever tested. So a lot of these theories can persist. A practitioner with the wrong philosophy can literally go their whole career without ever being proven wrong. and that will that kind of wrong-headedness can propagate, and especially if it ends up being profitable for the practitioner. But I come back to this idea of precision and all the ways that a patent litigation goes sideways. So many of them boil down to a contest over what was meant. My law firm professor was fond of. My law school professor, Professor Carl Moy, is a brilliant guy. He's fond of saying, it's like a coding. It's like a telephone communication over some sort of a digital network. You have these different opportunities to corrupt the data stream. So you have the idea in the inventor's head. A lot of times, as we all know, the inventors aren't even really clear on what they invented. They just have that feeling that they invented something. And I find they usually have, but it's the patent person's job to pull it out and figure out what it is they actually did. Most of the people I work with are too smart to work with old stuff. They would be bored if they were working with old stuff. So generally, if they say, I think I patented something, they're probably right. It's in there somewhere. You just got to pull it out. It's in their head. And then if you don't help them pull it out, they'll write it onto a page. And that's opportunity one to corrupt the data stream. And then that page gets read by a patent attorney. That's opportunity
the drafter.
Two. Yeah. Opportunity two for corruption. And then the drafter has to put it into words. There's another opportunity for data corruption. And then there's another reader who's going to read it, like a judge or a jury. That's another opportunity for corruption.
Yeah, an examiner in between there. Yeah.
Right. And the examiner is going to, corrupt it. And, the examiner may be from a background where English isn't their first language, and they don't understand everything you're trying to write when you communicate because of a different dialect or a different training with English. Even when you talk to somebody from England, you get it messed up, which I'm sure you will know, John.
Yeah, even if it's that's a whole nother issue. But even if their reading comprehension is terrific, they have to have the time to be able to do it. Given the current count methodology at the USPTO, I'm not entirely certain how many examiners read through the entire specification before issuing that first office action.
And then there's this thing, I would call it a myth. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was just saying, let's stick for a minute with just the drafting, and to go back to your word, precision, which you outlined some of the antithesis to that, which is these points where the corruption can come in from what the invention really is. And as I hear it, precision is to be able to distill and pull that out and make sure that that's represented in that application. And I'd be lying if I didn't think about some of the arguments I hear between the European practice and the U.S. practice. And for example, you've got a lot of the European presentation in a patent application is to say, this is the prior art, and this is my invention. Very clear, very direct, explicit support throughout the body. It's precise, it's distilled down. Let me juxtapose that with a lot of practitioners here in the U.S. that would never want to file it that way because of scope. So how do you write precision with scope of coverage to get that value proposition you both talked about? The value proposition may be lost if you're too precise.
There's a reason no one does Jepson claims anymore.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
So how? I mean, I don't disagree that there has to be clear disclosure. I mean, more and more you have these 112 issues popping up for written description or enablement, et cetera. I think the examining corps has been having meetings to say, hey, everybody, let's really start looking at 112 a lot more to see what the spec really says. And that comes along with this whole analysis of is the specification, really saying something? So I'm with that. But how do you combine those two? Precision, which is an ideal goal to be clear, to capture the invention, and then this value proposition, which may be expansive scope.
Let me ask you guys a question before we get pause on that question, I guess, Mike, which is how do you reconcile those two different jurisdictions and the different strategies you need to really bring home a good claim? But I'll ask you this question because I think it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it before John mentioned it, but if you built up a whole portfolio of Jepson claims today, knowing what we know about the AIA in the U.S., how much would that portfolio suffer versus a non-Jepson portfolio? Considering during my career, the doctrine of equivalence was almost destroyed, completely destroyed. And the AIA is this place where they seem to construe any failure to be precise against the drafter, against the patentee.
So yeah, you're essentially saying maybe you wouldn't lose that much by doing Jepson claims.
Yeah, or let me say it another way: are the people who came up with Jepson claims, were they just crazy primitive people, or did Jepson claims go out of favor because at the time the doctrine of equivalence was such a strong tool?
That's a good question.
I mean, that's a great question, and I think there's a lot there to unpack on the fly. But I'll just share, and anecdotally, I'll share how about just how the use of the background in applications has evolved. I think similarly, the Jepson wants to benefit from that. Tell me what is known, and then tell me what is new. And I've worked with a lot of different practitioners over the years, and so many have used that background section much differently. And some want to, especially, and again, we go back to Europe. There's a requirement to have that disclosure of prior art that's there, and demonstrate that kind of this is what's known, this is what's new. I've seen bad drafting or just slippery slope. Well, I won't say bad drafting. It's a slippery slope where you characterize something. Maybe you don't intend it. You say something in the background. Now you've got an admission by the applicant. And once that happens to you once, you're going to be you're just going to be trained. I'm not going to disclose too much. I'm not going to characterize in the background. And I'm definitely not writing a Jepson claim where some word that I put in the dedicated to the prior art portion will destroy the scope proposition. You get this conservative approach, and you're not going to get near it.
Whatever you say can and will be used against you. Yeah.
And you have that culture thing, I think what you're alluding to, Mike, which is the practice has its own, it has cultures, it has microcultures, it has a microculture in a firm. And somebody gets beat up on that in a firm, one partner, and that firm for a long time is not going to repeat the mistake of that one partner, right? Even though maybe they got a bad deal at the federal circuit.
So talking specifically about the background section for just a minute, like I think that when we are all starting out in law school, and we're kind of thinking about how we would be putting together applications, I think that we all look at that background section and think, yes, that's exactly where I'm going to lay out what the situation was before my great inventor came along and described this, new light bulb invention to me. So, what's the harm in laying that out? It helps explain to the examiner why this new invention is so great.
Or going before law school, if I was an engineer, wow, wouldn't it be nice if that thing meant something? Right?
But I think that one of the things that I've really appreciated in the last 10 years of practice is, part of that invention is really recognizing some of the deficiencies in that background. Sometimes the invention isn't so much what the inventor has put together, but in recognizing, hey, this is something that the background didn't have. And if you spell that out in the background section, it's real tempting for an examiner to use a hindsight motivation, to say, well, look, you said in the background that this need was not being met, and it's in the background, so everybody must have known that. But part of the invention was really having that first recognition.
And so, I think, go ahead, John. Yeah.
Well, and so that's why for my practice, when I'm working with outside counsel, we do cut the background fairly short. And it's because of that liability. So, we're often starting off the detailed description with a more lengthy discussion of, all right, here's why exactly the inventor was coming up with stuff in this space. And that way, if it's in the detailed description, it theoretically shouldn't be held against you the same way as if you put it in the background section.
Yeah. I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth here, but when I draft a specification, I don't even admit that anything's old. I just say, here's an embodiment and here's a second embodiment, and the second embodiment is better than the first embodiment. And I leave it to the examiner to connect the dots that the first embodiment may be in the prior art.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there is something there, but I have found, especially as for those that were practicing in arts that were really getting hit with this whole 101 quagmire. I mean, even pre-Alice, everyone was trying to navigate that space in the computer arts and others, obviously. But we really started to turn, or at least in my practice, started to turn to the beginning of that detailed description to kind of set that tone. And that was a little bit of more of our prose. We would use our prose before we would break into the aspects or embodiments that you were referring to, Matt. And again, to John's point, I think we've benefited a lot, both in 101, but in also just kind of setting the tone of what prosecution may bring with the prior art. Without putting it in the background, we can use that detailed description and putting it up front sometimes. Really, you hope that the examiner might get to that point sometime during prosecution and read those introductory paragraphs.
I think that's a good practice tip, Mike. I also do that. I use the first little discussion there. I had an examiner. I was in an interview once, and I was going over an application that I drafted, and the examiner was smart. He was on top of it, and we were plugging along, kind of blow for blow, not a whole lot of hiding the ball, so to speak. And he said, I finally explained to him what it is I kind of wanted, what the important thing was, and he says, "Oh, the invention, yeah, I see you put it here on page 9." And I took a lesson from that I wanted to use that section you're talking about, Mike, the very beginning of it, to hit it first. Like if you've ever taken a writing class from Brian Garner, he'll say something like, there's a finite amount of attention somebody will commit to a piece of writing, and like 10 units, let's say, of attention will be committed to a piece of writing. And if you break the writing into thirds, top, middle, bottom, they'll put something like 60-70% of their attention units into the top, and then they'll put like 2 to the bottom and 1 to the middle. So getting out there right at the start and framing it up in a way that's clear, I think, is really helpful. But you don't have to say prior art. You can twist it a little bit to say inferior, superior.
Yeah, good figures really help you with that too. If the examiner can kind of, I've got kind of an old school drafting technique, and a lot of what we do is mechanical, physical stuff. We do a lot of software too, but for mechanical applications, you kind of start from that big picture, and then you just focus in on, hey, this is the component and the aspect of that component that we're changing. If you look at Rolls-Royce's portfolio and look at those applications, I would say 8 out of 10 are going to be starting. Figure 1 is a picture of a gas turbine engine, and then figure 2 is the particular component of that. Yep, and then
figure 1 a cartoon.
We can talk more about that if you'd like, but that is the ideal, is that, yes, you would say, hey, look, not only do I want this to be cartoonified, but use the one that you did before. Like, we're only throwing this in for context. So no need to give a modern, cross-sectional diagram of the product that we haven't, even introduced yet. But you as in-house counsel really have to be on top of that, because if you're working with an inexperienced drafter and a first-time inventor, it's very possible that the drafter says, some context would be great. Can you give me a general assembly diagram for your gas turbine engine? And the engineer, who you've said, look, this is outside counsel, you can share information with them, and they give them, your brand new product diagram. That can be dangerous. So, that is one of our responsibilities as in-house counsel is what's in the application. Let's make sure that we didn't put too much in the application. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we kind of went off on a tangent there, but I think
that's right, though, especially in the mechanical arts. I mean, there's when we get to prosecution, you're interviewing with the examiner or arguing, and you've got those references. You've the visual with the text, without the text. We've gotten through allowance just on visual alone. The text was there, but it was the figure that kind of got them over the aha moment to kind of see the light of patentability. That brings me to another kind of general topic in drafting, which is this concept of style. Again, you walk down the hallway of a private practice law firm, an IP department, and you have varying styles of claiming, varying styles of drafting, lots of overlap driven by jurisprudence, driven by, shared training. And some shops out there are kind of espousing that they have one system. I don't know what's better or what's worse, but I've seen a lot of different styles out there. So let me put this back to you guys and say, is there a benefit to have readability over just pure raw content? If everything was in there and it was written very legalese and kind of set up for prosecution, but it didn't flow, it didn't have any prose to it, is that all that bad? Or should it be readable? Where do you stand on this?
Hey, Matt, can I take the first crack at this one?
Sure.
So I think that we as practitioners have a lot of tricks, right? Everything from, well, you've got to include these 6 paragraphs of boilerplate that explain that, a circle is not necessarily a circle, but could be an oval. We have a lot of those as practitioners, and some of that gets, really beaten into you. One of the most recent things that I'm seeing is that in order to guard against EPO prosecution, I'm seeing the claims be summarized in prose, not just in the summary section, but also at the end of the detailed description. And I kind of feel like some of these things that we're doing are counterproductive. At the end of the day, you have to, if you're going to be litigating this, you have to put it in front of a judge or a jury. And some of that very patent kind of lexicography, I think, can count against you. So the easier it is to read, and I forget who told me this, but I hope any future juries won't be prejudiced by my saying this, but like, I've heard from somewhere, and I think it was in law school, that the average juror reads at like a 9th grade level. Does not have any mechanical engineering experience. And so it is best to keep your writing as simple as you can while explaining the concept accurately. So that's my personal preference is when I see boilerplate and stuff like that, I understand why it's, being put in. I don't really tend to favor it.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you are going to do with the patent application or the patent should a grant. There's a number of technologies that come across my desk which are on weak grounds as far as value proposition goes, or the incremental advance over the art is pretty thin. But maybe to give the team an opportunity to participate in the patent system, which is an expensive way to recognize somebody's contribution, but nonetheless happens from time to time.
That happens to us too.
You might greenlight the patent application, or you want to generate some prior art, or sometimes you want to give your marketing team this ability to approach a business partner and say, if you work with us, you're not going to have to worry about clearing this patent. And also this patent reads like a marketing brochure, talking about the technology, all to get the value proposition in that case isn't the patent so much as it is the contract you'll enter into with the development partner to develop the technology together, and hopefully to some sort of a supply agreement that under which they'll buy your stuff or you'll buy their stuff. In that case, the contract is more important, and the IP is just something to open the door to get that contract signed by enticing them that you've got a big enough portfolio to worry about and you're the partner to work with. But coming back to what you were talking about, I guess, John, one of the guys that trained me up, he kind of denigrated one of my drafts once upon a time, and he said, this is not creative writing. If you want to get if you want to write a novel, go write a novel. Just don't do it here. We're writing patent applications, and these have to be precise. And I took that to heart, and I guess I can share a war story. I'll never forget. I was prosecuting an application. I don't think I drafted it. Maybe I did. But the prior art was a case from IBM, and the underlying technology was a microelectrical mechanical system, a MEMS cantilever that we'd open and close to protect a circuit at a board level from electrostatic shock during processing. Neat. Yeah. So my client had a very similar thing. The cantilever maybe was a little bit different. I forget where the prosecution ended up. But this the primary reference from IBM was drafted. It was very short, very sweet. And on top of that, it failed to use the keywords that would have produced a good search would have focused on. So that thing was like a torpedo, and it was so effective. You can't discount that there is a game here. The jury aside, and I appreciate that point, but there is a game here, and it's going to be litigator against litigator, mano a mano, and there are rules. And if you take advantage of those rules, you can get a good result. So it really kind of depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's fair. Yeah. So let me touch on that, because we all talk about how many eyes come into contact with this draft. And let me just put it out there. All the stakeholders inside the business are not, you may have sophisticated engineers that have filed multiple patents. You may have someone that's at maybe an executive level. They're VP of the business group or president of the business group. And for this project, they're interested. And maybe they're not as technically savvy as the PIs, as the inventors. And they're going to put eyes on, and they're going to have their opinion. And the marketing team always has their opinion. It kind of depends what channels they're going through during that drafting process. And as the drafter, oftentimes I think we're here defending ourselves, saying legalese. There's a reason for that. And I'm often wondering, is there a better way to have both? Because part of this is that's a good test group. That's a good test group, I think, for someone down the line, depending again what the end goal is. If you have that type of foresight to know what the end goal is for that patent, maybe it can be more defensible to be patentees heavy, or more defensible to be a little more prose, a little more readable and presentable, and still be precise. So I don't know if you see that with your stakeholders, of making sure they understand it.
That gets back to my very first comment, right? Of knowing your business need, right? Like if you are preparing this application knowing that your competitor is probably coming out with a similar product, and you are almost certainly going to litigate either this application or one of its continuity family members down the line, that you're going to pull out all the tricks with that one, right? You're going to make sure that you are providing ammunition to that future litigator. I think that is different than what Matt was saying when you've got maybe a first-time inventor and you're kind of trying to pull them into the inventing process. Maybe it's what we would kind of call like a lower tier application, where you're really just trying to make sure that your competitor can't file in that same spot. Well, then in that one, you don't need to have all the same litigation tricks in that one, because you're most likely not ever going to litigate that particular patent. And that really all comes back to cost as well, right? An application that I know I'm going to litigate, well, I may spend 10 times more for that application than I would for one that I'm just filing in order to block a competitor from entering into a particular space.
10x.
That's an interesting hub, Matt.
Yeah, no, I don't have a 10x delta within my portfolio, but also I don't know what your industry is like, John, but in mine it's quite mature, and there aren't too many smart Alex. I mean, there are copyists in far off lands, but that's kind of a different problem than somebody who's not trying to copy per se, but trying to, I guess, steal your market because they see what you did, right? I don't know.
Yeah, our industry, there are big players that are also making the final product, the gas turbine engine, but you also have to worry about the upstarts that are, hey, we just started a startup company and we're trying to be disruptive. Well, we need to be disruptive too. To trying to file stuff to kind of complicate or to tie down our suppliers. Let's say it that way, to kind of to give us a more favorable position when we go to negotiate some supply agreements. So it really runs the whole gamut, and that's why we really have different purposes behind different filings.
Yeah, in our industry, the assets are all $1 billion or more, which is a major barrier to entry. So you end up, there's just a few major players, and all the major players have very sophisticated compliance departments. They're all running freedom to operate clearance, just like everybody else. So if you do a decent job with your patenting the product, the chances of there being some issue is going to be pretty low. There's nobody trying to get away with anything.
Yeah, you would think that it would be a similar situation with jet engines, right? You don't have you can't walk down the street and have it made at Joe's Garage, but Joe's Garage can make fuel pump metering units, or they can make brackets, or you'd be surprised. They can try and make compressor blades. With varying degrees of success, and so all of those can impact our bottom line.
I can see that totally.
So let's take this now. We've got a drafted application. All right, we've gone through all of this. We've had all the time in the world to kick it around with all our favorite intellectuals to read all of the case law and to make sure this is the right application to file. We pull the trigger. Now we're prosecuting. So it's locked in. It's there. And there's questions that come up about what's the best way to prosecute. And let me start off with partly a kind of a strategy on filing, which comes down to the claims. So we talked about limited resources, limited time for an examiner to be studying the application. They're certainly reading the claims, and they begin with claim 1. So this is a long debated and strategized area, how to stylize those claims. Do we want to open up claim 1 and be the broadest claim possible? When I first came up, that I was trained up that way, looking through the NPEP and saying, look, we start up, this is the broadest version of what you can get. And that's evolved now. In fact, oftentimes we're filing cases where claim 1 is more of an educational claim to the examiner, kind of set the tone again, set the mindset so that when you get to some of these other claims where the terminology may change and the terminology may become a little broader for claim construction, there's still that same mindset in the reader, the examiner in this instance. They kind of get it. They get it already. So they're going to read it in that light. So again, gamesmanship. So my question is, what's involved in your practice? What do you see in your business, in your industries with regard to setting up for prosecution and how you set up the claim strategy for scope?
Want me to go?
Yeah, Matt, why don't you tackle that one?
I would say I haven't seen too much of an evolution over my 16 years in the industry, of my own personal approach to it. And my personal approach to it is that, there's a spectrum of examiners you're going to get, from highly sophisticated people who know how the system works and they understand their technology well, and they're going to give you a fair fight. On the other end of the spectrum,
that's a best case scenario right there.
Best case scenario.
Yep.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, you're going to get somebody who's doing a weak-minded job trying to optimize the bureaucracy for minimum input, right? I guess. And I think that the idea behind the story claim in claim one is kind of a regression to that low sophistication examiner. And I don't think that that's all that useful, because that low sophistication examiner is going to be a wild card anyway. Like, it's probably not even going to work. Whatever you need to do, it's setting up your whole strategy to make it through that gauntlet. When you have other areas of recourse, like an appeal, I feel like it's just not the best use of your ammunition. I've always thought it was just best to come out assuming that you get that good examiner, and then put the claim that you want right there, and then just wrestle that to the ground. The problem with the storybook claim or winning the examiner over with charisma is that it might work. And my mentor at the law firm told me, he gave me a little chestnut of wisdom a long time ago. He said, your best day in this practice is getting this really broad claim and being able to share it with with that vice president or CTO. And it's also your worst day, because as soon as that CTO sees that claim, he's going to think he's king of the world.
Let's enforce it. Yep.
Let's enforce it. And then the wheels are going to come off that bus 18 months later, and it's all going to come back to you and your clever claim. Instead, why don't you just get the claim to the thing you want? I don't have any problem with a claim drafted to the inventive contribution that the inventor made. And if it's small, then it's small. So be it. Like, I'm not going to try and outgame the system. I'll just take a small patent claim and move on.
I can really second that, Matt. I agree with everything that you said. And I just wanted to jump in on that last part about, I really don't mind focusing my claims on that aspect of the device or whatever that my inventors really contributed to. So because of that, I'm more than willing to do minor clarifying amendments during prosecution. If I will often find myself discussing office actions with outside counsel and saying, well, why don't we just amend to this, narrower limitation? But that's all that we were really going for anyway. That's really why we were filing this application. So I don't mind focusing in on that a little bit.
Yeah.
And often by giving the examiner, an amendment, it does a couple of things. I often find that when you are responding to, say, like a first office action, and you've got counsel saying to you, hey, look, I think the examiner is wrong on this motivation for combination. I go, okay, great. That and a dime will buy you a cup of coffee, right? It is very hard in my experience to convince an examiner about motivations for combination alone. If instead you're also willing to say, look, I see your point, examiner. I think that we could disagree that reasonable people of ordinary skill in the art would disagree about that particular combination. What this art is failing to show is this aspect of my invention, which is actually what my invention was really about anyway. That can be a good way to grease the skids to get to an allowance.
I agree. Yeah, I often switch I take off my legal hat and put on my engineer hat and spend the call talking about why it's cool. And all these examiners, they probably didn't go to engineering school because their parents told them. They probably had the knack. They just like it. And they like technology. They get excited by technology. They still get excited by technology. And if you can light that spark, hey, look, this is the thing we were struggling with. And then the examiner will say, I understand it. Just put it in the claim. And I'm like, okay, I'll put it in the claim. How do you want me to write it? And that can compact prosecution. Yeah, it generates estoppel. I understand these things. But like I said, the doctrine of equivalence is is on a long hiatus, and
Yeah.
there's no telling when it's coming back. And the pendulum swung even worse with the AIA. I mean, I went to Tom Irving's advanced chemical prosecution course a couple years ago, and he was backtracking on patent profanity. He was like saying, my whole career, I've always said, don't use patent profanity. Don't say maximum, don't say preferred or anything like that.
Yep.
And I've been through a number of these IPRs, and I got to tell you, like the profanity is the thing that saves the patent application. So it's really an interesting time for us, I think. I think that the whole American practice has taken a big shift towards that European model of low cost, simple, not as inactive as a space. I spend a lot of time thinking about it lately. I don't have a lot of insights to share, except to say in general, things are quite different than when I started 16 years ago. And, it's interesting to see how it manifests.
I think that this ties into realistic expectations for prosecution. Like what Matt was saying, if you don't want any estoppel, you can try not to amend, but understand that is, at the very least, that is going to extend prosecution. You are, if you're facing a first office action and you choose to apply argument only, you may be right. The examiner may have put together, terrible arguments, or maybe they're just relatively weak arguments. In order to find out about that, if you reply and are saying, well, examiner, I think that you misinterpreted this, the odds of the examiner saying, oh, you're right, I see the light now, they're not
Thanks
great.
for helping me. Thanks.
And so in order to get that through to an allowance, you're likely going to have to appeal at some stage to bring in someone else to say, hey, were those arguments, reasonable? And that just adds to your costs. So again, like if you go back to your business purpose, if this is your company's crown jewel application, fine. Then maybe introducing clarifying amendments is not a good idea. But most of the applications at a particular company are not crown jewel applications. They're middle of the road applications. They're important, but the company will get by without it. If you're a pharmaceutical company and this is your next Lipitor, okay, then maybe you take this all the way to appeal every single time. But if instead, this is a minor modification improvement, keeping your costs and business needs in mind is the best way to deal with prosecution.
Yeah, that's a great example. I was just going to add real quick. The attorney who sits next to me has that pharma background, and in that space, you get that 10x variable for drafting, like you said, John. I don't, in my practice, have a 10x variable in drafting. I might have a 10x variable in prosecution for a crown jewel type thing. But in pharma, they do spend a ton of time drafting that claim, but they've already done an exhaustive prior art search. They already know what they can get. Yeah. And the claim already says it, and they know how valuable the technology is. They've got it lined up. All the business cases are concrete, and they will fight to the death. And a lot of times they're right. If they did a good job identifying the prior art and drafting a precise claim, there should be no amendment. So,
and I think you kind of hit on it by mentioning a comparison to pharma for mechanical arts, et cetera. And, looking even into the computer arts, I see from the private practice perspective, I see a lot of businesses, a lot of applicants that may not have a full appreciation of what they've actually invented. So if we have the context, sometimes we've got the prior art, we've done diligence, we kind of know the scope, and I think you may get emboldened in that situation to say, no, we're comfortable. Your characterization of the prior art, examiner, is just wrong. So we're gonna hold that to you. Obviously, if it's a factual distinction, even on appeal, those are overturns much greater than a legal argument, such as John mentioned before. But the point being is, do you really have that appreciation? Many applicants, and not from necessarily your companies that are more sophisticated, larger companies, but smaller applicants, maybe they're looking at it and they don't have that diligence. So they're just for the first time reacting to what the patent office has said. And let's be honest, it's not necessarily the best office action every time. So there's got to be a balance. And you talk about protraction of prosecution. That's the world we live in. I mean, there's all kinds of stats coming out. First, there was a shift to say, hey, it takes this long to go through appeal, so it's better for you to RCE. And then, 3 years later, you see another publication. Hey, the RCE docket, it's a mess. You might as well appeal because you're going to be waiting a year anyways. So everyone's pivoting and trying to figure out the timing of all of this. And again, I think from your perspectives, that are particular to your industry and to your companies, there's something there. I look at it much broader spectrum, and I see a lot of things that it's really about communication. I think from my perspective is to say, you've got a dead to rights legal argument here, applicant. Like, I would appeal this. I will appeal this tomorrow, and I feel confident that we've got something here. But it's gonna cost you X, and it's gonna put you back 12 months to 18 months. So, are you okay with Claim 9? Pulling it up to Claim 1. I mean, that's a conversation that we have.
For just a second, something that I think is worth mentioning is that we see a lot of the same examiners over and over, right? Like we're filing in some very similar art areas, and there's some people that we will see frequently. And so we will sometimes strategically appeal in order to say, I didn't actually think that we got a very good office action on this one. Even though it may not have been one of the crown jewel cases, there are times where maybe we'll spend some money doing an appeal, essentially to kind of say, we don't want to see these kinds of rejections in future applications as well. Kind of as a, kind of a prod to the examiner, sometimes to kind of say, yeah, I didn't feel like that was the greatest. Knowing that we'll be in front of them again, and hopefully that will be a disincentive to issue those kinds of rejections.
Kind of like the mafia. It's like every once in a while you got to blow up a store.
Yeah, I didn't put it in quite those terms, but that's the idea.
There's a lot of these stats coming out too. These vendors are coming out saying, "Hey, we've distilled all these facts about these examiners. Here's the data sheet.
I love them.
What can you learn?"
Me too.
More and more, if the data's there, if it's accessible and you're able to make more informed decisions, I think it goes to that for those that are not continually in the same, TC, in the same art unit, talking to the same examiners in the same speeds. This is one step closer for the average applicant, I guess, to sit there and say, what can we learn about this particular examiner?
What's the examiner's win rate on appeal? That is definitely something that we look at frequently.
It helps you understand where you are in that spectrum of examiner quality.
Right. So here's a whole other thing that kind of relates to that, though, is the the overall style of prosecution. I keep coming back to that word style because I think it is a style. Some examiners want you to say the thing. They want you to put it down and say, my invention is A, the prior art teaches B, the prior art doesn't teach A. So I get that, except let's subtract the characterization of the invention. So all this litigation side of things, because once you've been burned in claim construction, once you've had someone go through with an expert and looking at the file wrapper and say, hey, here on page 1,158, this associate, wrote this thing, or this partner wrote this thing, and it says, here's my invention. Let's take that to the bank. That's what we're going to try to, convince the tech specialist, or convince the magistrate, the judge, of that's what it's supposed to mean. So once you see that, everyone steps back again. This culture to say, oh, can never do that again. So let's respond and say, the claim is the claim is the claim. That's all you get. Read the claim. It's self-evident. And the prior art doesn't teach that claim. And, that's what we do. That's what we do. It's a clean prosecution from a legal perspective, but sometimes it misses the mark because the examiner still doesn't get it.
That comes right back to your question, Mike, about how do you balance Europe versus America, or I guess it's America versus everyone else, because everyone else seems to be more like Europe, which is all derived from Germany, seems like. And you could say that here's the prior art, and here's my invention, and here's the difference, and it works great in Europe. That's what they encourage. And then that bit of estoppel that you talked about, there's not going to ever be a jury, and the judge is going to look at it in Germany in the claim interpretation portion of the enforcement action and say, I don't. That's interesting. I don't really care. I'll move on. It doesn't have the punch like it has in an American court, where that litigator will put it on a PowerPoint slide and put that one little sentence that associate wrote and blow it up, and it'll put it on the screen and let the jury stare at it for 30 minutes, and they'll be like, oh yeah, they really didn't have possession of that.
Yeah.
And it's a different. They're totally. You get two different treatments, and you got to balance that. I agree.
So
hard to do.
We're going through. You're prosecuting these applications. What's your take on the modern interview? It wasn't that long ago that it would be more probative to be, or just more advantageous, I guess, for allowance for various reasons, to fly to DC, fly to Virginia, to be there, sit down. The SPI walks in the room. Sometimes you have an inventor. Sometimes you have a stakeholder. Sometimes you have the invention or some reduction to practice. You're sitting there at a table and you just talk about it, and the record reflects only what you all agree upon, and you get an allowance. I can barely get in person nowadays because there's a human perspective. So, we have these interviews. Do you see effectiveness of interviews changing at all? Do you still think that leveraging an interview is advantageous?
Matt, maybe let me take the first crack at this one.
Mm-hmm.
So I always encourage interviews at every step of the process. This is, in a best case scenario, this is meant to really be a collaborative effort where the examiner helps you to get to a grant stage, where he says, well, you've got an invention in here, but you're currently claiming over the prior art, and that's why I'm issuing these rejections. But if you've got a kernel of patentability in here, let me help you. It's what they do with small inventors all the time, right? So I'm always suggesting that we interview. It humanizes you as an applicant. You're no longer, the big company with a huge portfolio. Now you're Bob giving him a call, and saying, hey, I just wanted to talk about, the rejections and what I think that the art is teaching, and why I'm not sure that you could combine them in the way that, you suggested. Not to go on fishing expeditions necessarily, but if you can, through those discussions, come to an agreement and say, oh, I really don't think that the art of record shows this, and I didn't see that when I was doing my search earlier. Heck, sometimes you can resolve something with an examiner's amendment, and you're done. it really doesn't cost that much more to do a telephonic interview. We encourage it. Now, when it comes to an in-person interview, I think that with hoteling, I honestly think that asking for an in-person interview could backfire. You've got an examiner who's hoteling from Philadelphia or Kansas City, and you say, well, I really want to have an in-person interview, and he goes, that means I have to fly to DC or to Denver or San Francisco and meet you there. I don't really want to do that, but I have to. It's the first office action or whatever. I think that can be counterproductive. So I always say interview. If they want an in-person interview and you've got counsel located near wherever they're going to be for that in-person interview, sure. Showing a physical model, it sure would be nice, wouldn't it, if we could animate some figures? I know that I would have been able to get some applications through a lot faster if I could have said, hey, look, here's how this thing actually works. It would have helped the examiner to visualize what the invention really was. So if they'll agree to it and it's something that would benefit from that, great. But just be aware that in our modern times, a lot of people are working from home.
And let me just interject on the demonstrative. I couldn't agree with you more, but let me tell you, you can do that, John. So we can certainly talk later about the different ways. Now, there are even simple 3D modeling can be created on the spot. You can demonstrate support for that in your specification and drawings. Even if there's not full support, you throw the caveat in person that, look, this is just for you to understand what this 3D rendering in motion looks like. We've used that to model in place of a real thing. I don't know that I have the pure data, but my gut reaction is it was successful every time.
I just meant in the application itself, since you can't.
I understand. Okay.
You can't put movies in a patent file.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good point. Good point. I guess that comes back to drafting quality. Maybe the drafter needs to bring it to life a little bit more.
More figures. Yeah. Let all the draftsmen celebrate, right?
That's right. That's right.
So I would have agreed. I would have said everything you said, John, a year ago, but my attitude has changed a little bit, and it's because of the big data. Depending on which service you can use, you can figure out which examiners like interviews and which examiners are responsive to interviews. And sometimes the data show that the interview is fruitless, and it just isn't a good use of resources to invest in it at that time. And some of these examiners, they're maybe introverts. They might be intimidated by the big brains on the other side of the line.
Yeah, go figure that they might be introverts, right?
and you got these high-powered attorneys, and on the other side of the line telling you you're wrong. It can be awkward. I think by and large, interviews are effective, especially if you are a nice guy and not a jerk. If you're a jerk, I don't know if it's going to work all that well. But I think take a peek at the data and see what your chances are with the interview. It just may be that this is not the case that you want to interview it with.
Oh, that's really good advice. That's a nice use of some of that big data I had not really considered. So, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're thinking about prosecution, we're talking about claim scope, protracted prosecution timelines, and that equals budget. I mean, one of the things that we look to, if you've got budget X, you can take a grant and file a con as opposed to appeal, then why not? I mean, if you can weather the maintenance fees and do that calculus, I'm saying, we're starting to see patent families and patent fencing, a term that's being thrown around, but But that type of approach and style, as opposed to, to going round and round and round just because you're right and the examiner needs to know how right you are, we can take something in the parent case and build something else out in a couple other cons. I look at that for a few reasons. Number one, you're going to get some overlapping coverage. And then number two, in the world of IPR, even if someone wants to take on the portfolio and start knocking them all down, that's going to certainly up the petition costs and really raise the level of challenge there. So I don't know if you all have thought about balancing, just budgets in prosecution and whether you've turned to thinking about the family and chopping up claim sets among cons.
Matt, you want to go first? Or do you want me to? Because I've got some definite thoughts on that.
Well, you're probably going to be a little more active in the con space. Frankly, when I came to SABIC, I spoke about this continuing application strategy to some of the people I work with, and they looked at me like I was cross-eyed. In this world of molecules, there's just the one. And they're like going for it, and if they don't get it, they don't get it. Mike's earlier assertion about the scope not being well known, I totally understand that, and I think actually the doctrine of equivalence and all kinds of things in this practice were designed to apologize for that misunderstanding of the scope, including continuation practice. The whole reasoning behind continuation practice is kind of an acknowledgement that the knowledge is imperfect at the time of application, and it would be unfair to lose the scope of the contribution just because you got the language wrong at the beginning. So you need to have a way to bend the language as the language evolves, as the knowledge of what the value evolves. So in my practice, there wasn't a lot of continuation. I've introduced some of it. Sometimes, Mike, I do it to kick the can, like you said. But if you've got a claim that's on the thing you want, you can't file in a continuation hoping to get a new examiner anymore. They ended that.
Yeah.
So you got to fight. And then if there's nothing else in the case that's valuable, you probably might not do the continuation. If there is something else that's valuable, maybe you can put a new claim set to that other thing. Ideally, the marketplace has evolved enough so that you can start to see some of your competitors starting to noodle around with your technology. Yeah. And then you start to, it's like, oh, can we draft a couple claims that are getting onto their roadmap? And that, goes more to the business instrument side of it than the recognizing technology as being new side of it. I guess it really depends on what you're trying to do and whether you file a continuation. In fact, Matt, I have a practice that Mike might remember. Mike and I worked together years ago. But when the case is allowed, you kind of go through a whole inquiry about what happened in the family all around the globe, what happened in the prosecution, and what's been happening in the marketplace. And you use all that data to figure out what to do next.
Yep.
Matt, that comment about continuation practice as a tool to go after other players in the marketplace as the invention starts to maybe get picked up or the technology to start to be utilized, that is absolutely something that I have seen, in my time in-house. It's a lot more expensive to file an IPR than it is to file a new continuation. So it essentially can become asymmetric warfare. You've got a problematic patent by
never thought of that. I like that.
You've got a problematic patent that you successfully from a competitor that you successfully challenge. Oh, well, it turns out that they've kept filing continuations and they've got 8 more applications lined up, and you think that each of them are invalid for the same reasons that the first one was. But good luck to you, because until you take them through that invalidity process, these are presumed valid. And so, maybe you don't do an IPR for all of them. Maybe you get, invalidity opinions or something like that. But that is still asymmetric warfare. It's a lot cheaper to file another continuation, and for that patent owner to file terminal disclaimers or whatever, and get another patent through the system, than it is to try to defend against that. And so when it comes to continuation practice, that's certainly something that you consider for your crown jewels of, hey, maybe I'm going to keep this alive, just continue filing things, because I don't know exactly how my competitors are going to try to implement something similar. I need to have an option for adjusting my claims to try to go after that design round.
I always think about it with regard to freedom to operate. If you're looking at a granted set of claims, and then the client asks, well, what about the family? And hey, yeah, well, they've got cons that are still pending. We don't know where they're going to. We don't know where they're going to take those claims. I mean, that's kind of what I come back to on the offense and say, to me, it's really a budget thing. It's not about the invention. It's well, it can be, but if you're in a landscape, competitive landscape, in your industry, and you're leveraging IP and patents in that industry, we just don't want that door to close. We've got a robust disclosure here. What else might we need to get? And I find that in those sets, that set of circumstances, the driving factor is not really just overall strategy. It may come to just budget. Like, can we really have 7 patents on that disclosure? Have we exhausted? Have we really wrung it out? And that's a really interesting applicant approach. I don't think everybody is going with that wring it out approach anymore. That's really prepping for something.
Well, no, it all depends on your initial application style too, right? Did you draft a massive application anticipating that you would, just keep filing those continuations, going after the additional disclosure? Like, oh, you had an inventor that was retiring, next month, and you couldn't pressure him into doing 7 applications, but you could put it all into one, and then try and wring that out later. It can be so fact dependent. Yeah,
it is. So if we continue on our journey here, we're through prosecution. It's granted. We've talked about this a lot of these aspects before. How IPR is changing the practice and changing every aspect, drafting and prosecution, et cetera. I know Matt mentioned his sitting through a CLE and getting some IPR updated advice. Anything in particular that our listeners would be interested in hearing anecdotally from your practices with regard to how IPR has changed your offensive or defensive approaches? John?
So one thing that I think people might find interesting about IPR is how that can be interpreted by some of your business colleagues. As you're explaining to them what can and can't be challenged in an IPR, and you say, well, we think that there's they're technical people. They read through and say, well, what the heck does this mean? This is indefinite. I don't know how to interpret this. And you go, well, tough. That can't be challenged at the IPR front. So setting up some expectations there has been interesting.
Yeah, when Mike was talking about continuations, I was reminded of this call I was on with a few of the executive folks on the project, and another counsel, kind of consider him a co-counsel from another company, had a very Nice way of explaining it. He just said, "This is the way the system works." Yeah, you're right. It's it's a huge issue, but it's not unusual. This patent system, frustrates all kinds of progress by creating doubt. And then if you feel energized, you can try and explain the economics of the patent system and why it exists and why it makes for a better society. But that's a hard one to pull off on short notice. But yeah, it's sometimes you get into these corners where you have some bad news, or you just have to say this is the way it works, and there's no fast forward. Indefinite claims. That's interesting. For me, for IPR, I'd just like to offer one idea that has occurred to me because I had this kind of interesting career where I went from mechanical to chemical, and in doing that, I switched from what are called the predictable arts to the unpredictable arts. The unpredictable arts are, what I think it was a term. I'd like to write a paper about this someday, kind of going through the whole history of the unpredictable arts, but I think it's a term used to characterize the fact that your patent application could just be a series of combinations from the periodic table, and in doing that, through an iterative approach, you could get all kinds of patents on things you didn't really invent yet. The chemical formula of something. You might be able to guess at the combination of letters and numbers and put it down on the page and get a patent application, but that doesn't mean you have inventive possession of it. So this whole unpredictable chemical pharma side of the world developed this practice where you have to show the office that you actually did something. And I think that the 101 people, the computer people, should try to revisit all of the reasoning behind that and bring it into their practice, not as a but for or a direct justification for patenting, but as a defense to 101. And I think if you can have your software case and you've got your flow charts and you've got all the right terminology, and you can show data from a simulation where you actually have some sort of physical measurable difference between one software and another software, whether it's the rate that the database is populated or the
processing
burden of the process
improvements. Yeah.
There's got to be something that you can measure, and if you can measure it, I feel like the office ought to say you've made a prima facie case that you are satisfy the requirements of 101. And I think if you had now, how does that tie to IPR? It seems like IPR, they're always wanting more and more evidence that you actually did something. They want clear evidence, a very clear explanation of what your invention is, evidence that it worked, or that it somehow advanced the art. And if you had these simulation evidence or experimental evidence as part of that proceeding, I think things would go a lot better for you, because you can just say, look, no, it works. What do you want? Call it whatever you want. Secondary factor or non-obvious evidence of non-obviousness. Call it whatever you want. Thing is, my thing works. It does something no other thing did before. I get to keep the patent.
I like that. I think that's insightful and a good analogy.
Yeah, I think it feeds back to this kind of storytelling. A word that has keep coming back into my conversations is narrative. When I'm talking to inventors, I'm like, what's our narrative here? What's our story? What are we trying to say? And we can use that to kind of extract some of those parts and pieces to build the spec. But the spec can have a narrative itself. In fact, it goes back to everything we've talked about today with regard to, is there a benefit to have a narrative presentation to what you're doing? Because when you get to litigation, there's a narrative there. Maybe what some litigators want is the ability to change the narrative to fit the time 15 years down the road. I'll leave that up, for debate. But if you have the narrative now, I think you can put that together. So to Matt's point with 101, The guidance that the PTO is putting out, where the board is coming down and finding that there is eligibility, it's connecting those dots already. It's saying, okay, yeah, it's abstract, but you're applying it to a particular application. And your suggestion that we take it one step further and say, yeah, we applied it to that application, and it actually did what we thought. Yeah, and here's what it did. I mean, that's the case closed, I think, at least where we are at 101 today. But again, I think it comes back to that. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, I think it's a good opportunity for software practitioners as well. We all know the price tag for a patent hasn't changed in 20 years. And there's a lot going on because there's a lot of stuff, I think, underlying that I haven't seen too many people talk about. And I'm not going to get into it today. Suffice to say that some stuff happened. And as a result, the value of patent applications has been flat or decreasing. And I think that there's an opportunity there, provided you can convince your client. There's an opportunity there to differentiate and to add a new service that you can bill for, which is not only am I going to write you your software patent application, I'm also going to help you design a simulation that you can run. Hey, it's a computer, so it shouldn't be that hard to build. Design your simulation, capture the data you need to make it through an IPR. I think that's an interesting option for the practice. I mean, and it's old hat in the chemical world. We ask our scientists to do experiments purely for reasons of patenting frequently.
All the time. Yeah.
So,
with your crossover, mechanical moving into the chemical arts, and seeing that, I had similar experiences. And I'll be honest, I don't know if John had the similar experience as a physicist. And now my graduate degree went on to computer arts in artificial intelligence, but with that physics basis, I get into a lot of different technologies, and I have been trained up with various partners and various groups, and there is a different mindset. If you're in the mechanical group, they're thinking about things one way. If you're in the computer arts, it's another way. If you're in the chemical arts, it's another way. And then, of course, you've got the pharma folks, which I don't even walk down that hallway.
But a world of their own.
My point being, right, is I don't know if there's enough sharing of that information in the hallways across industries. I think the practice could really benefit across, and to get back to quality of patent, I think each individual patent could benefit from sharing tips and tricks across the aisle here.
Yeah, I would love to read an article about the history of the unpredictable arts, why it's that way, and how it could be mapped to the predictable arts.
It sounds like
I look forward to reading your article.
Topic for another podcast.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I think we've kind of concluded the journey we wanted to take today from drafting through grant, and I appreciate the time that both of you have taken to kind of just spend some time chit-chatting about this in a very open forum. I think the listeners will appreciate that, kind of hearing anecdotally a lot of the things that we've touched on today. So, John and Matt, thank you very much for your time.
Well, happy to be here, and in these times, a little human interaction is nice.
It was a pleasure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
For the record, John's referring to we're in the very beginning of the insanity of 2020 COVID lockdown.
Yeah.
So we're all working from home, wondering what's coming next.
For the people listening to this podcast 10 years from now, this is what's going on. Yeah.
This is our time capsule. Maybe we should do some director's cut afterwards.
I'm all for special effects.
That's right. That's right. Well, again, I think we'll probably close the recording then and edit this out. But as expected, that the time flew by. But I think we actually Got some really good content within an hour here, and I expect that many listeners will appreciate the kind of candor and free talk. So I appreciate you guys joining.